Look at this photo. April 1998. He is 21 years old, and he is smiling like a man who has just won everything. The cap on his head is brand new. The jersey in his hands still smells like the box it came out of. Around him, cameras flash. In front of him, a contract worth more than $31 million. Behind that smile is a certainty so total it almost glows. He is going to be the greatest quarterback of his generation. Everyone in that room believes it. He believes it most of all. The man in this photo will wake up on a jailhouse floor. Not after a decade of fame. Not after a slow fade. Within 4 years, his career will be over. Within 14, he will be a convicted felon in a state prison, and his name will have become something worse than forgotten. It will have become a punchline, a shorthand. When football fans want to describe total failure, they will not explain it. They will just say his name, Ryan Leaf. But here is the part nobody tells you. The drugs did not end his career. His career ended first, clean and sober, all on its own. What happened after that is the real story. And the real story is stranger, sadder, and in the end more hopeful than the punchline ever allowed. So keep that photo in your mind. Keep that smile. We are going to come back to it. But to understand how a man falls from that stage to a cell floor, we have to go back to where the certainty came from. We have to go to Montana. Great Falls, Montana, is not a place that produces football royalty. It is a wind-blasted city on the Missouri River, closer to the Canadian border than to any NFL stadium, in a state that had never sent a single player to the first round of the NFL draft. Not one, in more than 60 years of drafts. Montana produced ranchers and airmen and hunters. It did not produce saviors of billion-dollar franchises. Ryan Leaf grew up there as the oldest of 3 boys, and he grew up big. By high school he was a giant, 6'5" and built like a linebacker, with an arm that did things arms from Montana were not supposed to do. He could stand flat-footed and throw a ball 70 yards. He was an all-state basketball player too, the kind of athlete a small city builds its Friday nights around. And with that talent came something else, something that would follow him the rest of his life. A swagger, a mouth, a need to be the best in the room, and a need for everyone in the room to know it. The college recruiters mostly stayed away. Montana was off the map, and the big programs did not come calling. The school that took the chance was Washington State, a rain-soaked campus in the wheat fields of eastern Washington, a program that lived in the shadow of its own conference. The Cougars had not been to the Rose Bowl, college football's oldest and grandest stage, since 1931. They were nobody's idea of a launching pad, which made what happened in 1997 almost impossible to believe. That season, Ryan Leaf did not just play well. He detonated. He threw for more than 3,000 yards. He broke conference records. He dragged Washington State, the perennial afterthought, to a conference championship and to the Rose Bowl for the first time in 66 years. Grown men in Pullman wept in the stands. And when the votes were counted for the Heisman Trophy, the award given to the best player in all of college football, Ryan Leaf finished 3rd in the nation. The 2 men ahead of him, Charles Woodson and Peyton Manning, would both end up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That was the company he kept. That was the level. And this is the first thing the punchline gets wrong. Ask a casual fan today, and they will tell you Ryan Leaf was a fraud, a guy who was never any good, a scouting mistake anyone should have seen. The record says otherwise. He was an All-American. He was a Heisman finalist. He had a bigger frame than Manning, a stronger arm than Manning, and a highlight reel that made scouts lose their composure. The talent was never the lie. The talent was real, which is exactly what makes everything that came next so hard to look at. Because in the spring of 1998, the question hanging over the entire National Football League was not whether Ryan Leaf would be a star. The question was whether he would be picked first overall, ahead of Peyton Manning himself. And if you think that sounds absurd now, if you think no serious person could have looked at those 2 men and hesitated, then you were not there in 1998. It was a real debate. It was the debate. Scouts were split. Executives were split. The whole sport spent months arguing about it. Two teams sat at the top of that draft. The Indianapolis Colts held the first pick. The San Diego Chargers had traded a fortune in players and picks to move up to the second, specifically to guarantee themselves whichever golden quarterback the Colts left behind. Two franchises, two desperate fan bases, two young men who would be forever chained to each other by a single decision. One of them would become, by many measures, the greatest regular season quarterback who ever lived. The other would become the measuring stick for catastrophe. And the maddening truth, the truth that took decades to come into focus, is that the difference between them was never the arm. It was never the size, never the numbers, never anything a stopwatch or a tape measure could catch. The difference was invisible. It lived somewhere behind the eyes, in the place where a 21-year-old keeps his fear. The Colts spent months trying to see it. One meeting at a time, one interview at a time, they were about to find it. The Colts did their homework the way you would expect a franchise betting its future to do it. They watched every throw both men had ever made. They ran the numbers, the physicals, the psychological profiles, and on raw material, plenty of evaluators leaned toward the kid from Montana. Leaf was bigger. Leaf's arm was stronger. Leaf had carried a worse roster further than anyone thought possible. Even the famous writer Hunter S. Thompson, a lifelong football obsessive, sent Colts owner Jim Irsay a letter that season, refusing to lend him money to sign Manning, telling him the Leaf boy looked strong and Manning did not. That letter is real. It resurfaced years later, and Leaf himself shared it with the world, because by then, it read like the darkest joke ever written. But the Colts were not just measuring arms. They were measuring something else. And in the interviews, in the meetings, in all the small, unguarded moments that a months-long courtship exposes, the two quarterbacks began to separate. Manning showed up like a man, applying to run a company. Prepared, obsessive, almost frighteningly serious. Leaf showed up like a man who believed the job was already his. The stories that leaked out of that spring painted a picture of a kid who was brash, where Manning was careful, casual, where Manning was consumed. None of it touched his talent. All of it touched something more important, though almost nobody could name it yet. On draft night, the Colts took Peyton Manning first overall. And here is the detail that history flattened. San Diego was not disappointed. The Chargers had traded 2 first-round picks, a second-rounder, and players to climb to that second slot. And when Ryan Leaf was still on the board, they sprinted to the podium. They believed they had won. Their general manager compared the moment to a coin flip, where both sides came up gold. The city of San Diego, starved for a franchise quarterback, threw its arms open. That is the photo. That is the smile. A team convinced it had just drafted its next 20 years. The contract made it official. 4 years, $31.25 million, built around an $11.25 million signing bonus, the largest any rookie had ever been handed in the history of the league. Ryan Leaf was 21 years old, from a town of 50,000 people in Montana, and he was suddenly one of the richest young athletes in America, anointed the savior of a franchise before he had taken a single professional snap. The first cracks showed before the season even started. That summer, the league gathered its incoming rookies for a mandatory symposium, days of lectures about money, media, and the traps waiting for young millionaires. Leaf famously did not show up, reportedly choosing a golf outing instead, and eating the fine that came with it. It was a small thing, it cost him pocket change, but inside that small thing was the whole future. The rules are for other people. The advice is for other people. I am different. And then, for 2 glorious weeks, he was different. Leaf won his first 2 starts. San Diego was 2-0. The kid looked poised, and the columnists began writing the story everyone wanted to write, the one where the Chargers had quietly won the draft. Radio hosts floated it. Fans repeated it. Maybe, just maybe, they had gotten the better quarterback. Week 3 was in Kansas City, in one of the loudest stadiums in football. What happened there was not a bad game. Bad games happen to every quarterback who has ever lived. This was something else. Ryan Leaf dropped back 15 times and completed 1 pass. 1. He finished with more turnovers than completions. He was playing sick, fighting through a staph infection he would only talk about years later, but nobody in the stadium knew that, and it would not have mattered. The final numbers went out across the country, and for the first time, the word appeared in print next to his name: bust. The game, though, is not the moment. The moment came the next day. Sunday afternoon, back in San Diego, the locker room was open to reporters, and a beat writer from the local paper named Jay Posner walked over to Leaf's locker to ask about the game. It was the most routine act in sports journalism, and Ryan Leaf detonated. He rose off his stool, all 6'5" of him, towering over a seated reporter, and screamed down at him, "Don't talk to me, all right? Knock it off." His voice cracked the room in half. Teammates froze. It took the team's captain, the great linebacker Junior Seau, to physically pull his young quarterback away before it went any further. And one camera caught all of it. Understand what 1998 was. Cable sports television had just become an empire that needed to be fed 24 hours a day. Highlight shows ran on loops. Talk radio ran on outrage. And into that machine dropped 5 seconds of tape. A rich, top-drafted, 22-year-old quarterback, one day removed from one of the worst games ever played, screaming at a man sitting down. The clip ran that night, then the next morning, then all week, coast to coast, on every sports desk in America. The team made him write an apology to Posner, and he delivered it, but reporters present said he reportedly crumpled the statement and tossed it away the moment he finished reading, and that detail traveled too. 5 seconds. That is what it took. Not the interceptions, not the losses. 5 seconds of video, and the story of Ryan Leaf stopped being about football forever. He was no longer a struggling young quarterback. He was a character now, a villain in a national show, the spoiled brat, the entitled child, the anti-Manning. Every mistake he made from that day forward would be slotted into that story, and he would make so many mistakes. Go back to the photo for a second. Draft night, the cap, the smile, the certainty pouring off him like light. 6 months. That is the distance between that photograph and the locker room in San Diego. 6 months for everything in that picture to begin dissolving. And the cruelest part is that the 22-year-old at the center of it had no idea the fall had even started. He thought he was having a bad month. He was not having a bad month. He was becoming a national punchline in real time, and the machine that builds punchlines does not reverse. What it does instead, to a young man whose entire identity was built on being the best in the room, is something we are only now, decades later, honest enough to talk about. The rest of 1998 was a slow-motion collapse. Leaf finished his rookie season with 2 touchdown passes and 15 interceptions. Read that again, 2 against 15. The Chargers benched him, and the losses piled up, and the cameras never left, because by now Ryan Leaf was reliable content. Every glare on the sideline, every clipped answer at the podium, every rumor of screaming matches with coaches fed the machine. He fought with the front office. He alienated the locker room, and on the other side of the country, Peyton Manning was throwing more touchdowns than any rookie in league history, so that every Leaf story came pre-packaged with its own devastating comparison. The two men had been drafted 1 pick apart, and America checked the scoreboard between them every single week. Then came year 2, and year 2 simply vanished. An injury wiped out his entire second season before it began. 1999. Gone. All of it. 12 months of standing on the sideline in street clothes, while the franchise he was supposed to save kept losing without him. For a struggling young player, a lost season can be mercy, a chance to reset out of the spotlight. For Leaf, it was a pressure cooker. When he finally came back in 2000, he was not a phenom anymore. He was a 24-year-old with everything to prove, and nothing left in the bank of public goodwill. He went 1-8 as a starter that year, and here the story acquires a detail so cinematic that if a screenwriter invented it, you would not believe it. In February of 2001, Ryan Leaf got married and flew to Tahiti for his honeymoon. While he was there, on the other side of the Pacific, the Chargers' new general manager began gutting the roster of football's worst team, and the first name on the list was his. San Diego waived Ryan Leaf while he was on his honeymoon. He had not even heard the news yet when his agent confirmed it to reporters. 3 years after the podium, and the flashbulbs and the record bonus, the savior was released into the ocean of unwanted players, and the team still owed him the final $3 million installment of that famous signing bonus. They paid it. They considered it worth every cent just to be done with him. What followed was the long, quiet humiliation that waits for every fallen first-rounder. Tampa Bay claimed him, watched him for a training camp, and cut him. He landed in Dallas, where a desperate Cowboys team gave him 3 starts at the end of a lost season. He lost all 3. The next summer he went to Seattle, fought for a roster spot in the preseason, and did not win it. And in the spring of 2002, Ryan Leaf retired from professional football. He was 26 years old. The final line of his career reads like an autopsy. 25 games, 4 wins and 17 losses as a starter, 14 touchdown passes against 36 interceptions, barely half his throws completed. The man drafted 1 spot behind Peyton Manning was out of the league before Manning had reached his prime, and the verdict was unanimous and instant. The biggest draft bust in NFL history, not one of, the standard against which all future failures would be measured, the name every draft night broadcast would invoke for the next quarter century as a warning. Now stop, because this is the moment to say the thing that almost nobody in that era understood, the thing that rewrites the entire story you think you know. Ryan Leaf's career died completely sober. There were no drugs in this collapse, no substances, no addiction, no dark secret chemistry. Search the wreckage of those 4 years and you will find immaturity, arrogance, injuries, and a young man emotionally unequipped for the most scrutinized failure in sports. But the addiction that everyone now associates with his name had not started yet. It was still years away. The popular version of this story, the one where a talented kid threw it all away on drugs, has the timeline exactly backwards. Football did not fall apart because of the pills. The pills came after, and they came for a reason football helped create. Because think about what remained when the noise stopped. He was 26, rich and radioactive. His entire identity, from the Friday nights in Great Falls to the Rose Bowl to the draft stage, had been built on a single load-bearing idea: I am a great quarterback. That idea was now a national joke. He could not watch television in the fall without hearing his name used as an insult. Old teammates were still playing. Manning was becoming immortal, 1 record at a time, a weekly televised reminder of the other road. And Ryan Leaf drifted, out of the spotlight, and into a silence he had never once practiced for. He tried the businessman's life for a while, working as a financial consultant, a job about as far from a stadium as a man can get. The years passed quietly. From the outside it looked almost like peace. Then, in 2006, he found what seemed like the perfect way back. Humble, honest, redemptive. A small university in the Texas Panhandle, far from any camera, offered him a chance to coach quarterbacks. To teach the game he loved to kids nobody was watching. Friends called it the healthiest thing he had done in years. Nobody could have guessed that this quiet coaching job, this modest new beginning in the middle of nowhere, was where the true catastrophe of Ryan Leaf's life was waiting for him. It would not arrive looking like temptation. It would arrive looking like medicine. The wrist. Go back to the photo one more time, to the draft stage in 1998, and look past the smile this time. Look at the hands holding that jersey. Somewhere in the years of sacks and hits and falls, the right wrist attached to that golden arm had been damaged, badly enough to nag him through Tampa Bay's training camp, badly enough to follow him into retirement and keep aching long after the game stopped mattering. It was the most ordinary injury in football, and it is where the second half of this story begins. At West Texas A&M, coaching quarterbacks in the quiet Texas Panhandle, Leaf went to a doctor about the pain, and the doctor did what doctors across America were doing by the millions in the mid-2000s. He wrote a prescription for Vicodin, a powerful opioid painkiller. Ryan Leaf would later say it was the only drug he ever used. He did not need another one, because the pills did something no trophy and no contract had ever done. They did not just quiet the wrist. They quieted everything. The punchline, the shame, the nightly replay of a ruined name. For a few hours at a time, all of it went silent. A man who had spent 8 years as America's favorite failure suddenly had an off switch, and it fit in his pocket. The descent from there followed the same brutal staircase that millions of American families came to know in those years. The prescriptions ran out and stopped being enough. He got clean for a stretch, then relapsed, and the addiction began making his decisions for him. In 2008, everything surfaced at once. Leaf resigned from his coaching job and was later charged with stealing prescription pain medication from the home of one of his own injured players. The investigation that followed found he had obtained nearly 1,000 pain pills from area pharmacies in a span of 8 months. 1,000 pills. The former second pick in the draft, the $11 million man, going door to door through small-town Texas drugstores. In 2010, he stood in a Texas courtroom and pleaded guilty to 8 felony drug charges. The sentence was a fine and 10 years of probation. No prison. One last chance. One thin rope back to a normal life. He took it home to Montana, wrote a book about the glory season at Washington State, gave a few speeches, and tried to rebuild. For about 18 months, he was clean, and it almost looked like the story would end there, in quiet, unremarkable recovery. Then his own body betrayed him one more time. In 2011, doctors found a tumor growing on his brainstem. It was benign, but it had to come out, and the surgery was followed by rounds of radiation. Think about the cruelty of that equation. A recovering opioid addict, alone in rural Montana without a real support system around him, handed the one thing recovery cannot survive: legitimate, unbearable, medically certified pain, and the pills to treat it. By the end of that year, he later admitted, he was using again. This relapse would not end in a courtroom lecture. It had 4 months left to run, and it was headed somewhere much darker. In late March of 2012, in his hometown of Great Falls, Ryan Leaf broke into an acquaintance's home and stole prescription painkillers. He was caught and arrested. And then came the detail that tells you everything about what addiction does to a human mind. 2 days after being released from jail, he did it again. Another house. Same town, same crime, same week. Postal workers had already tipped off a drug task force about the suspicious packages arriving at his door. Investigators searching his home and truck found dozens more pills. 4 felony charges. Texas immediately moved to revoke his probation. Every rope was gone. Ryan Leaf woke up on the floor of a jail cell on the morning of April 1, 2012, dressed in a suicide prevention gown, 35 years old, a 2-time home burglar. National news for the worst reason yet. That floor is where this story has been heading since the first sentence, and it deserves to be told plainly, without decoration. He has spoken openly, many times since, about what he carried into that cell. Years of depression he had never named, and thoughts of ending his own life that had followed him through the darkest stretch of his addiction. By his own account, he was a man who had already been looking for the exit. And by his own account, that floor is also where something shifted. He would later describe waking up there as the moment he finally stopped negotiating with reality. He said he had to be humbled to that exact point, because no gentler point had ever reached him. The system, it should be said, was not finished humbling him. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to prison time with a treatment placement, and then got himself thrown out of the treatment center for threatening a staff member, a last flare of the old Ryan Leaf, the one who fought everyone holding a mirror. That outburst bought him a transfer to the Montana State Prison. Concrete, razor wire, a cell. The number 2 pick of the 1998 NFL Draft, 14 years almost to the week after the flashbulbs and the record bonus, was inmate number whatever they assigned him, and the country barely blinked, because the story felt finished. Punchline complete. Nothing left to see. Except that inside those walls, with no cameras left to perform for, and no reputation left to defend, something began that nobody outside would learn about for years. It started, of all places, with other inmates who could not read. He has described it like this in the years since. In prison, stripped of every identity he had ever performed, he ended up working in the library, and there he began helping fellow inmates learn to read. Men who had never finished a sentence on a page were sounding out words next to a former Heisman finalist, and by his own account, it was the first thing in his adult life that had nothing to do with Ryan Leaf being special. Nobody in that room cared about the draft. Nobody cared about Manning. He was useful, quietly, to people who had even less than he did, and he has said that this, not football, was the first time he understood what purpose actually felt like. He served 32 months in all. In December of 2014, the gates of the Montana Correctional System opened, and Ryan Leaf walked out at 38 years old with a felony record, a destroyed name, and 32 months of sobriety he had never once managed on the outside. What he did next is the part the punchline never had room for. 90 days after coming home, still shaky, he checked himself into inpatient treatment voluntarily because he had reportedly learned the one lesson that had eluded him for 40 years. He could not do this alone. And when he came out, the man who had once banked an $11 million signing bonus took a job, according to the recovery organization he joined, as a driver. $15 an hour, shuttling other recovering addicts to their meetings and appointments in Los Angeles. The biggest draft bust in NFL history, holding the door, loading the van, learning names. He has called it the best job he ever had. From there, the climb was slow and completely unglamorous, which is exactly why it held. He became an ambassador for that recovery community and started telling his story out loud, hundreds of times, in prisons and treatment centers and school gyms, sparing himself nothing. He got engaged to Anna, a former college volleyball player, and in October of 2017, they had a son. They named him MacGyver, and Leaf joked publicly that he could not believe he agreed to it, and you can hear in the joke a man astonished to have a family at all. Broadcasting came next. First small, a regional network here, a radio show there, the shadowing of other former quarterbacks who had made the leap. And in July of 2019, ESPN, the same machine that had run the locker room clip on a loop for 20 years, hired Ryan Leaf as a college football analyst. He told the Associated Press that 5 years earlier, sitting in a prison cell, he would have called the idea absolutely crazy. Honesty requires one more hard paragraph, because recovery is not a movie. In May of 2020, Leaf was arrested in Palm Desert, California, after a dispute involving his wife, on a misdemeanor domestic battery charge. That October he reached a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor count of false imprisonment. The battery charge was dropped, and he received 3 years of informal probation, a required year-long domestic violence class, and no additional jail time beyond credit for the days already served. His attorney stated publicly that the incident had nothing to do with substances and that Leaf remained completely sober. It was a public stumble in a life now lived under a permanent microscope, and he kept going. That is the truth of it, no bigger and no smaller, because he did keep going. He kept broadcasting, kept speaking, kept showing up. He worked college football games year after year, rejoined ESPN's roster of analysts, and then, in June of 2026, came the news that closes this story where it stands today. Ryan Leaf was named the lead Pac-12 college football analyst for USA Network, the top voice on the network's coverage of the very conference where he once became a legend, with a handful of college basketball games thrown in for the kid who was once all-state on a Montana hardwood. 28 years after the draft, the biggest bust in NFL history is not a cautionary tale hiding from the world. He is on national television every autumn Saturday, talking about the game that broke him, sober, employed, married, raising a son. Now look at that photo again. April 1998. The cap, the jersey, the flashbulbs. Look at that smile one more time, knowing everything you know now. For 25 years, America looked at that picture and saw arrogance, a punchline in the making, a warning. But that was never what the smile was. It was a 21-year-old from Great Falls, Montana, who had no idea that the fall would take 4 years and the climb would take 20. No idea that the worst thing that ever happened to him would start with a doctor's prescription, or that the best thing would start on a jailhouse floor. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest quarterback of his generation. He will be remembered instead as proof of something rarer, that there is a human being underneath every punchline, and that the story is never over while the man is still alive. Some men lose everything and get the chance to climb back. Others never get that chance at all. Next time, the story of a superstar whose fall had no comeback waiting at the bottom, because the fall was the end. You will want to sit down for that one.